Hi everyone, welcome back to Extra Credit, and this is our 5th episode on ancient Greece. So as we continue setting the stage for the great war to come between Greece and Persia, it's time now to skip over to the other side of the Mediterranean and see the player on the other half of the field, the Persian Empire. Now, even though the Persian Empire is actually a massive deal in world history, we here in North America tend not to know very much about it. This is partially because our own view of history is so highly colored by the Greeks themselves, who considered the Persians barbarians and therefore second class. But like every society in world history, the Persians deserve to be understood on their own terms. And when we look at them fairly, we see that they actually had some really good ideas that the Greeks didn't have, such as actually wearing clothes. So when you look at this current map of Western Asia, you'll notice a rather large country sandwiched in between Iraq and Afghanistan called Iran. Like all the countries around it, Iran has a long and noble history of its own, which we can glimpse by looking at a map from before 1935, where instead of Iran, you'll see a place called Persia. This is because the land contained inside these borders was once the heartland of the ancient Persian Empire, a collection of territories so vast that it once spread from India to Egypt and beyond. Persia was the great world superpower of its day, a cultural mosaic that united millions of people of different ethnic and linguistic backgrounds under one banner. The Persians boasted an unmatched military force of hundreds of thousands of troops that they could command from across their domain, followed a religion called Zoroastrianism based on the worship of the supreme god of light and truth named Ahura Mazda, and also developed the ancient world's fastest and most efficient mail delivery system, Khurajan Prime. In terms of government, far from embracing democracy like the Athenians, or the very weird mixed bag of the Spartans, which is so weird that we didn't even go into it, the Persians instead were an absolute monarchy, meaning that they were ruled by a single great king, who oversaw the entire empire from the great capital cities of Persepolis and Susa. Now, like certain other ancient empires we've discussed elsewhere on this channel, the Persians sometimes get a bad rap as brutal dictators whose people were terrified living under their iron fist. But the reality is that this just isn't an accurate picture of how most empires actually function. The truth is that whether you lived under the Persians, Romans, Egyptians, or any other of the great empires of the past, life was probably pretty good so long as you paid your taxes and followed a few simple rules. And yes, by pretty good I of course mean as good as life can possibly be before the invention of Tylenol and Frosties. But when the Persians invaded the land of Greece in 490 BC, kicking off the Persian Wars, which are the main subject of this series, the Greeks certainly believed that their dignity, freedom, and entire way of life were on the line. The Persians, for their part, expected the invasion to go pretty smoothly. After all, how hard could it possibly be to bulldoze a few puny city-states and add another stamp to their world empire bingo? But if we want to understand this conflict in its full historical setting, we need to take the example of our good friend Herodotus, the great historian of the Persian Wars, and go back all the way to the very beginnings of the Persian Empire itself to see how the seeds were sown. As we do that, it's important to remember that this section of Herodotus in particular qualifies much more as legend than actual history, which is partially just the reality of dealing with any historical events that happened 2,500 years ago, and is also the reality of dealing with an author like Herodotus, who was physically unable to resist telling a good story, whether it was true or not. All of which is just my way of saying that when it comes to what you're about to hear, consider yourself warned. So in the days before the Persian Empire existed, the land of Iran was occupied by a bunch of different tribal groups, the most powerful of which was called the Medes. Now the Greeks used the terms Medes and Persians interchangeably and didn't really see any difference between those groups, kind of like how my parents' generation just called all of these things Nintendo. Which they are not, Mom and Dad, they are not. But in the year 585 BC, a man named Astyages became king of the Medes, and it's with him and a couple of his bad dreams that our story really begins. King Astyages had a daughter called Mandani, and one night in his sleep he imagined that he saw her urinating, making such a flood that it filled his entire city and drowned the whole of Asia. I did warn you. As if that wasn't disturbing enough, sometime later Astyages had a second dream in which a vine sprouted from his daughter's womb and once again filled all of Asia. Now Astyages was no dummy, and he knew that these dreams could only mean one thing, namely that he really needed to lay off the curry before bedtime, like wow. No, what his wise men told him was that these dreams were actually prophecies that his daughter's son, i.e. his own grandson, was destined to overthrow him and one day become the ruler of all of Asia. Naturally, Astyages wasn't exactly thrilled to hear this, and so he took the usual course of action in stories like these and hired a trusty servant of his to dispose of the child. The trusty servant in this case was a man named Harpagus, a relative of Astyages and a member of the royal family. But as also usually happens in these kinds of stories, Harpagus turned out not to be as trusty of a servant as Astyages thought. You see, rather than leaving the child to die, Harpagus had too much of a soft spot, and so instead he found a shepherd couple, gave the baby to them, and the shepherd couple raised it as their own, eventually naming it Cyrus. As the years went by, Cyrus of course grew into a strong young man with no real idea of the destiny that awaited him, until one day the truth came out. How the truth all did come out and what happened next is a long and bizarre story which includes but is not limited to a game of house that went terribly wrong, a secret message delivered by a dead rabbit, and a particularly nasty case of unintentional cannibalism. Again, the warning. But in the end, the point is that after escaping the early death planned for him by his wicked grandfather, Cyrus was sent away to go live among his own people, the Persians. You see, despite being a Mede on his mother's side, Herodotus tells us that Cyrus was actually a Persian on his father's side, which is a random detail that I promise you will become a very, very big deal next time, so stay tuned. But before Cyrus could kick out Astyages and take what he now believed was his rightful place as king, he lacked one very important thing, or actually several hundred very important things: followers. So to get some trusty men on his side, Herodotus tells us that Cyrus hatched a plan in which he summoned all the strong men of Persia to meet him at a great big field that was completely overgrown with thorns, thistles, and weeds. Pulling out a whip, Cyrus forced the men of Persia to clear away all of these tangled bushes in one single day of back-breaking labor until there was nothing but a clear, open field left in its place. The next day, Cyrus gathered the Persians to the same field again, but this time, instead of pulling out the whip, he put on the biggest barbecue any of them had ever seen, treating them to a mouth-watering feast that lasted from dawn till dusk. Once the last mouthfuls had been polished off, and the groaning men were passing around the bottle of Tums, Cyrus stood before them and asked them which day they had enjoyed more. After hearing the rather predictable answer, Cyrus then shouted to them, "Men of Persia, if you do as I say, all the pleasures you enjoyed today will be yours 1,000 times over. If you disobey me, though, you will be toiling as you did yesterday for days without number. So follow me, cast off your chains, down with Astyages." And the rest, as they say, is history. Actually, who are we kidding? This is Herodotus, so the rest is still an impenetrable mixture of myth and history, but you know what I mean. So with the men of Persia officially behind him now, Cyrus went on to fulfill his destiny, overthrowing his grandfather Astyages and becoming the first official ruler of what we now call the Persian Empire. In fact, over the whole course of his life and career still to come, Cyrus would go on to do so many great things that after a lot of very deep thinking, historians would give him the nickname Cyrus the Great. Cyrus's most famous accomplishment of all time would be conquering the mighty and ancient kingdom of Babylon in 539 BC and adding it to the Persian Empire, also taking this opportunity to set free the Jewish people who had been captive there for 70 years, thus earning him a couple of major thumbs up in the Bible. But what concerns us most for this series is that as Cyrus went about his business conquering new lands, the Persian Empire slowly began to expand westwards, creeping inch by inch towards a little-known Western Asian kingdom called Lydia. And as we'll see next time, the drama that would unfold between the Persians and the Lydians would have massive historical consequences. Because it just so happened that the kingdom of Lydia was a hop, skip, and a jump away from another little place you may have heard of, called Greece. See you next time. Hey everyone, thanks again for watching Extra Credit. It's always a blast making this show, and it's been a lot of fun to tell you this story so far. This week's pop quiz is, which modern-day country used to be called Persia? Remember to drop off your answer in room 215 for your chance to win a prize. As always, work hard, read books, play outside, and we'll see you next time.